Well, good morning, everybody here in the room. It's good to see another good turnout here this morning, and certainly, I suspect we have a good audience online and probably growing as we work through the morning. And I'm excited this morning to have the opportunity to introduce Brigadier General Stephanie Ahern. Stephanie is, I felt compelled to do this as a former engineer and now one of our most talented strategists, contributing in amazing ways to how we think about the future of our Army. And I can't think of a better person to be here today to open up this morning's session with her remarks, and I'm sure, as we've seen with the other panel discussions, she'll set the table in an exceptional way for a rich discussion that follows. I think one of the things I'd like to highlight really about Stephanie, you can read the details in her bio. She's obviously serving currently as the Director of Concepts for Futures and Concept Center at Army Futures Command. She is a good partner with the United States Army War College, sharing her time here to help engage with students and broaden their understanding, students in our senior service college programs. But importantly, I think it represents the great synergy and potential for collaboration between this sort of institution that aspires to be a global thought leader on strategic land power and the organizations across our Army that are charged to do many of the things that were in the panel we talked about yesterday: organizational design, future thinking, assessment of the environment. And we've been very pleased to support and collaborate with Stephanie and her team on a future studies program here for a number of years running here in support of Army Futures Command. And we are excited about that and the opportunity to continue that. So Stephanie, we're really glad to have you today, and let's give her a round of applause, please.
We understand you're at Army Futures Command, but Army Futures Command is a little bit of a new animal for many of the folks that have been in academia or retired out of the Army and haven't seen Army Futures Command before. Can you talk about, I know you're in concepts, but can you talk about the role of Army Futures Command and the role of your concepts division, if you will, within that, please?
Absolutely, and Professor Kate, well, thank you so much for agreeing that I don't have to stand up and speak a script. So Army Futures Command, we're not quite 4 years old, and so it was the first time since 1973 that the Army has stood up a new four-star command, in part to make sure that the future had an opportunity to get to yes. And so they found that as we were developing new capabilities, looking at new concepts, that so many people had the ability to say no. And there was also so many opportunities to add in more requirements that what we ended up buying took forever. And by the time it got to soldiers, it was outdated or didn't meet their needs. And so Army Futures Command has three core parts that we do kind of internally with many teammates, though. The first one is the future operational environment, and I think Dr. Mike Dennis is here. I know he's speaking on the next panel. And so this is our Directorate of Intelligence and Security, led by Ed Mornston. It is effectively our G2, and so they look at not only threats, so the future threats that we're going to be likely facing, and then also the future operational environment. So what is the distribution of power? What are the opportunities that all countries, all actors are probably going to face? The second thing that Army Futures Command does is to develop future concepts. And so that's the aspect that my team, along with others like Matt Olson, who's in the front row, looking across at the different warfighting functions. And so we're looking at how we could operate, equip, and organize in the future. And so one of the things with Army Futures Command, though, is that if you have those of us in the concept community that in splendid isolation come up with these ideas, they're probably going to look much more like fantasy or science fiction. And so that's why even on the slide that General Murray, our first CG, had, is that there was a light bulb for the concepts, and right beside it was a beaker. Because in the Army Futures Command, we have also most of the labs, the Army Research Labs, the DevCom centers as well, to make sure that as we're developing the concepts, we're partnering from the very beginning with the scientists and technology experts in the Army, of which there are many, also informed by the threat. The third major role that we have then is that future force design. So looking at when we understand what the future might be, could be, looking at concepts about how do we operate, equip, organize from that, then we have to go through from experimentation, of which there is a significant resources within our Futures Command, whether it's the battle labs, whether it's the Joint Modernization Command out at Fort Bliss, whether it's through a series of experiments that we have, then saying what are the material and the non-material requirements that we have from that. And though based off of what from the Army processes or the joint processes, we say, yes, these are the gaps that we have, then we work with the many different partners that we have, and this is where the Assistant Secretary of the Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, ASALT, then brings it together to say, based off of the priorities from our Secretary-in-Chief, based off of the priorities from the SecDef and our national leaders, what are the material and non-material solutions that we need to invest in with people, money, and time. And so that delivering the good ideas, the items, the capabilities that our warfighters need, how do we do that then more quickly? And so that's when it becomes a very large modernization enterprise effort. Again, priorities from the Secretary all the way down.
Wow. That sounds great, ma'am. I appreciate you going into that detail. You talked a little bit about DEF CON experts, and I'm not quite sure what a DEF CON expert is, but it sounds like
I'm sorry.
something important.
So the one of the commands that is within Army Futures Command, we call it, the short is capital DEVCOM, but it's the Combat Capabilities Development Command. I apologize. So Major General Miles Brown, it's headquartered in Aberdeen. But they have scientists and technology experts kind of across the globe. But they are the ones that's where really our hub of the S&T experts are. They also have a pretty large group of operational research systems analysis to make sure that from a data standard perspective, they're also that hub of expertise for the Army. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Well, that sounds like you got a war college education in a hurry there with all of the enterprise management that we talk about. So that's wonderful. But you talked about the battle labs, you talked about centers of excellence. We've got several representatives here from those. How do they fit into what Army Futures Command does with modernization?
Super, thank you. And I would say that my time is a little, I think it was last week, but within the past 2 weeks,
That's fine, ma'am.
Secretary Wormuth put out a new Army Directive 2022-07 to help refine, clarify these roles. But really what it is there is a tremendous partnership across the different Army commands, working with Headquarters Department of the Army, working with the Secretariat. So the Centers of Excellence, all within Training and Doctrine Command, TRADOC, and those are our warfighting functions and other supporting. So mission command of where Colonel Olson is, we have obviously the intelligence, the maneuver, fires, and so forth. And so each one of those within TRADOC has a Center of Excellence CG, so 2-star. Within that, those are also the commandants for the different schoolhouses. And so, growing up as an engineer, had an engineer commandant, but then you had a Center of Excellence CG that looked over engineers, military police, and chemical corps.
The branch
right?
schools.
Exactly. So within the Army Futures Command, we need to make sure that we, again, not only the concepts folks, but the S&T, that we're informed by those specific centers of excellence, but we're also looking farther in the future as well. And so within the Capabilities Development Integration Directorates, so the CDIDs, those are Futures and Concepts organizations. And so they sit alongside our Center of Excellence partners that are looking at the nearer term issues from training, recruiting, development, making sure that as our doctrine is updated, that all of those are aligned with it. And then the CDIDs, which are a Futures and Concepts Center, they are the link to make sure that as we're developing the concepts, and then as we're developing the material and non-material requirements, they're informed by the current, but aren't constrained by it. And so there is a very strong partnership with the CDIDs, with General McKean, Lieutenant General Scott McKean, who's the Futures and Concepts Center Director, along with Lieutenant General Ted Martin, who is the CAC CG. So that there's strong partnership across CAC and FCC, which are TRADOC and AFC, to make sure that as we're planning for the future, that we're getting all of that expertise. Specifically from the Army Directive that the Secretary just signed, Army Futures Command is responsible for force design and force development. So force design is that 5 to 15 years out. We're looking at 2040, so that's still within that force design time frame. And then force development, which is usually in that 2 to 7 year time. TRADOC is in support of Army Futures Command for that force development to make sure that we're pulling the expertise, but that Army Futures Command is ultimately responsible, working, of course, with ASAL and the Secretary for force design and force development.
So they're separate chains of command, but they're integrated by function.
Yes, yes.
Very good. Well, some might say that the Futures Command, your AOR, is the future. So with that comes into technology, but it sounds like your organizations coordinate with a lot of different actors.
We do.
You've already talked about some of the relationships between TRADOC and AFC, and they're separate but different. Could you also talk about how Headquarters DA fits into that, how FORCECOM fits into that, where some of the boundaries are? How do you navigate, I guess, between, you have some time horizons,
Yes.
but how do you navigate between the roles, authorities, and missions, so to speak, between the organizations?
It is always helpful when you have top-down guidance of what those roles, responsibilities are. And so maybe you'll start at the Army Command level. So talked about TRADOC and AFC. FORCECOM, they obviously have the mission to train, deploy combat-ready individuals and units where the combatant commanders need. And so one of the other initiatives that Army Futures Command has really been championing alongside FORCECOM is that as we're developing new capabilities and as we're trying to determine how best we could employ them through how we operate, is that we're having soldier touch points, a soldier-centered design, so that we don't, in that splendid isolation, come up with the best possible capability and then hand it to the soldier and they're saying, why did you give me this to do that? And it stays in the mill van. And so one of the very deliberate efforts is to make sure to get FORCECOM units to have hands-on opportunities with prototypes. And so this is one of the opportunities that Congress has also given us, is that we're able to have these soldier touch points, to continue to work with industry, to update them, to modify it so that the soldiers, it's most useful for how they're going to use it on the battlefield. So that's FORCECOM, making sure that we have units that, as they're modernizing, are giving real soldiers, real units, opportunities to make time to experiment, in addition to their training to be ready to fight tonight. Army Material Command, you didn't ask that, but one of the sustainment challenges that I know has come up repeatedly, and one of the topics that General McKean, General Richardson, and what from a concepts that we are seized on, the Army Material Command, the sustainment expertise across our Army is phenomenal. And so as we're looking at the joint warfighting concept, of which we won't talk much here about, but the Army's specific functional battle of which we're responsible for is a joint concept for contested logistics. And so Army Material Command is that sustainment expertise for the Army, but also in many cases for the Joint Force. And so not only does AMC, the Army Material Command, provide that sustainment expertise throughout the logistics and acquisition cycle, but they're also our inject, again, the broad sustainment community, to make sure that as we're planning for the future, that we're directly looking at sustainment issues as well. As far as HQDA, I would say, of course, as they do with all, they integrate and synchronize to make sure that as we're looking at 2040, that we're not looking at that by ourselves, making sure that we're linking Army 2040 with the main effort right now of Army 2030, in addition to the rearm, making sure that as we're trying to modernize as rapidly and efficiently as possible, that this makes sense. And so HQDA is really that integrator and synchronizer across, working directly with the Army, the ASALT, so Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, that is really kind of that spearhead for this whole modernization effort.
That sounds complicated too.
I listened very closely at War College.
There you go. Madam, one of the things that we talk about is the authorities and the resources, and it sounds like you're talking about you have some authority over resources, but that leads into budget and Congress usually. So what are the budget lines, so to speak, or how does that affect your organization? Joint Forces Command, one of the things they kept saying was a challenge with them is they had all the authorities but none of the budget responsibilities. So how's that work?
So from the inside, to me, there are needed differences of roles and responsibilities. And so one of the important things within Army Futures Command is when you look at the future operational environment, when you look at concepts and you look at requirements, those are all things that help make priorities and prioritize decisions more informed. And so we can look at the threats, we can look at the challenges and the opportunities in the future, and we can figure out more creative ways to operate with equipment that we have. We can figure out what are new equipment that we need. And then to make sure then to say, if we're facing this threat in these environments, these would be some capabilities that we would need. This is new training that we need. This is new education. But at the end of the day, it has to be prioritized. And part of that is what you fund. And so that's why we're doing some of the upfront work based off of where our leaders from the Army and from DoD and the country are telling us. But then ultimately we're giving them choices. But it's much more informed choices about what are the trade-offs. And so Army Futures Command doesn't have authority over the budget, nor should we. We are able to very closely provide input and provide suggestions from an S&T perspective, from an equipping, the actual platforms that already exist, but then also how we're spending time experimenting. And so those are the ways that we are helping leaders make more informed choices about the future, because at the end of the day, FORSCOM, AMC, and TRADOC, they have to be worried about the current. And so having Army Futures Command, having the opportunity to not just worry about today, but to say, how is today informing tomorrow? That's the role that we play.
Well, that clarifies it quite a bit. I appreciate that. We've been talking about technology gaps a lot this week, and part of the problem is understanding our authorities, roles, and where the resources come with. But you deal with concepts. How do we catch up with technology gaps or with these gaps that we have in our capabilities through concept development or through your organization that you're closest to?
Yep. No, thank you. And I think one of the benefits of I've got half of my team that's at Fort Eustis, but that half of the team used to be the entire team at Fort Eustis before a year ago, and so we're now split between the headquarters in Austin and Fort Eustis, in part because we do Army concepts, but we also do joint concepts. And so the team that works, that does the war game, the future study program that General Hill mentioned, they're at Fort Eustis so that they could drive up and not get stuck in Austin. We also, from the joint side, all of our joint partners are somewhere between the Pentagon and Suffolk. And so they've stayed at Eustis. We've stayed in Austin. But one of the things, again, as we're talking about innovating or transforming, there's two main reasons why a concept is a concept. So one, it's an aspirational way of the future. It's not a strategy. If you know where you're going, you don't need a concept. But how could you operate, equip, organize differently? And it's because either the technology doesn't exist, so these are some capability gaps that we have. We haven't used the capabilities, the technology in a creative enough way. So Blitzkrieg is one of the best examples where that was all World War I technology that the Germans used in a creative, very German way to achieve tactical and operational success very early in the battlefield. Or both, where you actually have new technologies that you're using in new ways. However, it's not just us that's on that battlefield. And you've got the environment is changing, so there are things that everyone is going to have to be responding to. But the countries that could be potential adversaries in the future are investing very heavily in certain things. And so capability gap could just be because there is change in X, Y, or Z. Right? It could be because another country is developing these and we have a gap because of that. And so from a concepts perspective, what we can do is try to help, what are some of those capabilities that we actually most need based off of a threat we can project, but we can't predict. And so that helps then from the priorities, is that we may need 1 million things, but there may be 200 of them that are most important, how we would be able to operate, equip, and organize. And so that's where our concepts can help inform, if from experimentation, It's developing a more effective way to operate in the future. Again, not that we're not concerned about efficiency, but effectiveness really, really matters, especially from a peer adversary. That allows us then to inform decision makers, is that as they are coming across their priorities, here are things, if industry can support and the technology is there, that we may want to press on as hard as possible. And that's where a concept can help kind of pull that through. Experimentation has to help inform what works better.
Wow, that is another great wide field. We had talked about some of the things like we have gaps in our network capabilities or resiliency. We talked about the intelligence piece. We talked about how sustainment is a challenge, and then the protection piece that still exists there. Where can we find out more about what you're doing about some of those things?
So, great question. I think part of it would depend on if you are able to only access unclassified information or not. And so Army Futures Command has a website, so like that's an easy way to go to. General Richardson, our CG, he was testifying on the Hill.
And this is unclassified, man.
Yes, exactly. He was testifying on the Hill 2 days ago, and so some of the experiments of which we are absolutely so proud of. There's actually one that's going right now. It's called EDGE, so the Experimental Demonstration Gateway event at Dugway Proving Grounds. So most of the cross-functional teams are there, along working with DARPA, looking at swarm technology. How do we make sure that our systems are integrating? We've obviously got so the PENTAX, so the Precision Navigation Timing exercise. It's annual, making sure that in a globally positioning system, GPS denied or degraded environment, how can we still operate? Project Convergence, which is the capstone event, that's the culmination of our campaign of learning. There are many things that everyone would be able to understand what we're doing. If you are able to get, whether it's CUI or classified information, there's a lot more ways to tap into this, and I think it's really, that's one of the reasons I appreciated being here, is that we actually want and need as many people at whatever classification level people have to be able to contribute. And whether that's small businesses, whether that's the large businesses, whether that's academics, whether that's folks here at the War College, this is not a small tactical problem. And so understanding, America's innovation and our ingenuity, that is a strength. How do we make sure that people understand this problem and then help us work through different solutions?
Now, we talked about the homeland as another
Yep.
panel that we had, and modernization efforts, I understand, for going for large-scale combat operations, but the homeland is no longer a sanctuary, so who's modernizing or coordinating the modernization effort for the homeland? Is that Army Futures Command, ma'am?
Yes, and?
It depends.
Yes. Oh, yes, and. But I think we actually have one of the leading thought leaders here. Jennifer, would you have any comments, and I'll follow you up?
A former deputy commander.
The leading thought is no one. The real answer is that it is a gap. I don't think I'm not aware of anybody in the building that is trying to coordinate the private sector and industry for mobilization and defense of the homeland within DoD. Certainly DoD partners with the interagency community that has, you go to DHS and look at CISA that is dealing with the critical infrastructure sectors, and DHS has done a great job at integrating and coordinating with all the various critical infrastructures, but no one is really, I think, looking holistically at how to bring to bear industry to support mobilization or defense of the homeland. That's the unfortunate piece of it.
And would absolutely not counter that. I think one of the, so Army Futures Command, again, we're not bound by geography. As we look at future concepts, we are still expecting to play an away game. And so from just a passe comitatus, we're not planning to have maneuver within the United States other than for training. But we also aren't expecting, as you said, the homeland to be a sanctuary. And so there are, not in the part of Army Futures Command that I am, but there are active engagements with how, from a cyber perspective, from the organic industrial base, of which Army Material Command is also responsible for, looking at missile defense. There are some initiatives, and this is a national effort, that's for sure. And so making sure that Department of Defense is playing a role of that. The other thing that I'd say, though, is that the Army has pressed hard on, and this is really with very strong support from the War College, is on the Arctic. And the Alaska is also part of our homeland. And so I'm not trying to be pedantic, but it's an important aspect as well. And so there are a lot of efforts from the Army, but also Department of Defense, also the U.S. government. One of the efforts that we're working on specifically is as far as how do we maneuver in the Arctic. That's one of the efforts that we're working on from a concepts perspective, both from an Army, because there are many things that ground forces that the Army are able to do from an endurance perspective, from even just sensing that we helping Army-specific problems, but then also especially from a joint perspective, based off of the competencies that the Army is able to provide. And so that's the one specific thing that we're looking at actively. But I know that there's a lot of work within Army and DoD to really put a stronger focus on this.
Can I just, you had mentioned our Army innovation and working with private sector, and this maybe is kind of related. We've done a great job within DoD and the Army and the other services as well, is to try to spur innovation, to get new ideas into the system, to think, beyond today, and to think as 2030 and 2040, and start up companies and seed these people. The challenge, though, is I think the department as a whole, and the Army too, I guess as an extension of that, is unable to take the small business that you invested, $10 million or whatever the number is, to innovate in some great way, to then turn that into a program of record. And so you build up these companies, these small businesses get to a point, and we've done all these experiments and whatever, and it's a great idea, and then what? Right? So what are you guys doing to try to bring that over and get them to the other side so that these great innovations become programs of record?
So thanks for asking that. And so again, it's not my part of Army Futures Command, but there is an active effort. So the Army Futures Command has 3 different deputy commanding generals, and one of them is my boss, Scott McKean. Another one is Lieutenant General Thomas Todd, and he's in the Acquisitions and Systems, A&S. And so one of the efforts that he is very actively working with Army Applications Labs that sits in the Capitol Factory inside Austin. So it's right in the middle of the Keep Austin Weird and entrepreneurship. But how do we get the company present the challenges that we have, and then small businesses that really are a driver of innovation, to help them see how they can put that network together. Because right now, and 2 days ago, I was one of the folks that she's on a fellowship now at AAL coming. She just was in a private company working just affiliated with SICE, went into a regular. But how do we start breaking down some of those barriers? So it's not just the government or not just the major defense industry that are pulling those together. And so one of the ways is how do we identify some of the challenges that we have? And when you look at some that you mentioned, so sustainment, protection, information, deep sensing, those all have explicit civilian applications. We within the defense community, not enough coffee yet. There are specific challenges that we have in addition to those, but one of the very active parts within Army Futures Command is not just saying we want small businesses to participate, it's trying to find active ways to get Americans who want to help and who want to make make money as businesses, to be able to contribute. And so alongside the partners, like the major defense industry. And so this is something that is being actively worked on, and this is the Army Applications Lab. That's another website for folks to look at. They are actively trying to work through what are small ways that many, many different partners can be able to help in this space.
Very good. Thank you, sir and ma'am. You talked a little bit about autonomous weapons, and we've talked about autonomous weapons or autonomous drones and all this high-speed stuff that we're supposed to be getting into the future. What can you tell us about what you're working on, or in an unclassified forum, what is it that you see based on what's going on over in Ukraine, and has any of that shaped or influenced what you're working on?
Of course.
Thank you, ma'am.
But I really appreciate the question, and I'd say, so I've been in the job for about 21 months. My first week, I got the opportunity to talk to General Murray, and just to get marching orders, what's the direction forward? And one of the things that he wanted to make sure that from a concepts perspective that we were looking at was when you have artificial intelligence, machine learning, when you have autonomy, when you have robotics and synthetic biology and advanced manufacturing and quantum computing and all of these things that exist today, how do we fight differently? And not only us, but how are we going to have to respond differently? And so that was the initial marching orders that we got 21 months ago. And then a month or two after that, Nagorno-Karabakh happened. And that was at a small scale of two geographically smaller countries about what is the potential for future warfare. And so this has really been driving a lot of our efforts, is that it's not just us that's trying to think about the future. The role of autonomous systems, whether it's human on the loop, off the loop, in the loop, there are a lot of different ways to employ this technology. And even with Edge, the demonstration, we all watched the Olympics and saw hundreds or thousands of drones working together in a very confined, predictable space. And that's usually not how warfare goes. And so we are actively working with partners, industry, working with the Centers of Excellence, working with DARPA, working with how do we understand and to be able to program and start building trust among soldiers and units, but then also what's possible. The one thing that I'd say is that by 2040, we absolutely expect the human-machine teaming to be critical. We have to be pressed on what must humans do. And if it's dull, dangerous, dirty, and we can get a machine to do it, we do this as Americans, right? But we ought not, as an engineer, we not have, going into a breach, a human. No grappling hook person should ever have to exist again. There are things that working with the humans and machines, that teaming, can allow us to do so that the people that we care about most, our soldiers, are doing what they must do and what they're really good at. The other thing that I'd say is, and you didn't ask, but I'm going to mention it, is that how we fight in the future really matters. I have 2 kids, and I want them, and if I ever have grandkids, to be very proud of what we're doing. General Murray, from his leadership, and now through General Richardson, West Point has Lieber Institute, which is Law of Armed Conflict, and so their mandated is to look across academics and across the legal community and to what are the implications of changing warfare from a Law of Armed Conflict perspective. And so they've been partners with us since the first Future City program that we have, trying to make sure that there are policies that can evolve. LOAC will not. And so as we're thinking through how do we have this human-machine teaming and what are we using future robotics to do that by 2040 will not be Terminator. But still, there are real implications for what we're doing, and how do we not wait until 2040 to start having those conversations with Americans. And so that's been one of the things that we've been very actively partnering with them with strong support of our commanding general as well.
Thank you, ma'am. That brings up, I think, time for our last question. Then I know you wanted to get a opportunity for questions from the field. But I know you're in Austin, Texas. There's a reason for you being in Austin, Texas. You want to partner. You talked about partnering with different colleges, academia, get smart folks involved. What is it that you want us to be looking at? What can we help you with? What questions would you like folks to take and think about and then get back with you on?
So I would say one of the there are so many challenges in the future that we have. That's not just the Army. That's looking at those that care about being able to make choices and having freedoms that we do. And I would say that one of just people understanding what is the future that's out there, but then what are the ways, again, as Americans, that we can help ensure that our way of life and our ability to protect the future soldiers, what can you do? And so I think one of the things we've partnered with the Modern War Institute, and we actually have an ongoing writing competition, but how within your expertise are there things, and some of them may directly relate to the Army, and some of them, like, please find those, whether it's within industry or within academia, to help. But this isn't a small, isolated problem within Army Futures Command. There are some really big areas in the future that we are concerned about. So of course we're going to be maneuvering. Of course we're going to still be applying, kinetic and non-kinetic effects. But our ability to sustain our forces and sustain operations in really challenging environments is only going to get more difficult. Our ability to communicate, to have, to understand where we are in the world, to be able to make decisions that are more effective. So that ability to use and employ information, whether it's ones and zeros or whether it's ideas. We're seeing it today. Books have already been written about the role of that. And then I'd say from a protection perspective, based off of the potential fights we may get into, we simply can't buy our way to get enough technology to be able to counter, to be able to protect ourselves, to be even able to survive. We need new technological solutions, but we're also going to have to change how we organize. Again, what we saw in Nagorno-Karabakh, if you could be seen, you could be hit. If you could be hit, you could be killed, right? So having very, very large formations that are masked, command posts that give these massive glowing signals. If all of your sustainment vehicles happen to have this really bright, shining thing because they're passing data all the time, it's going to be really easy to find them. So how we organize, but then also how we operate. And again, this is where the innovation of, from our lowest private, through the NCOs, the officers, the warrant officers, these are challenges, the sustainment, the information, the protection, that we really want and need as many brains involved in this as possible. So thanks for asking.